Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Suleiman the Magnificent Part 3, Sultan of Sultans by Extra History. Now last time we saw Suleiman's impressive victories in both Belgrade and Rhodes. Now he gets a chance to return home and govern the empire in relative peacetime. We'll get to see how that goes in this video. I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As the fountains in the Seraglio whispered, he thought of those days right after his first sweeping conquests. It was a time of victories and tragedies, but he remembered as a young man thinking that he had done so much right in those days. He'd had a sense of confidence and purpose in each great, romantic, momentous decision. And yet now, as an old man, so many of those decisions tasted of ash.
Damn.
He remembered returning home from his campaign in Belgrade to the bitter news that two of his sons had died, his infant and his eldest. He was left with only Mustafa.
Well, I do hate to say it, but we've talked about this in previous episodes, but when it gets to the point where the Sultan dies and his successor must be appointed, if you've got a couple of different sons, one of those sons is going to become Sultan, and he's probably going to kill the others. Not to try and lighten the blow, but, maybe it's best you only have one potential heir.
He wept, he raged, and then in that very same year, his favorite concubine bore him a new son. He had fallen in love with her, that fire-haired concubine. Her name was Roxolana, and he loved her in a way that he'd never loved his wife. He remembered how passionately he felt, how passionately he still felt for that Polish slave that he would one day make his queen.
And she was a pretty influential figure within the court, right? This is a court in which, this is true for a lot of these type of situations, women did not necessarily play a public political role, but they had a lot of influence behind the scenes, especially on the Sultan himself. His concubines, the female members of his family, they could have a lot of influence on political affairs, and Roxolana here, she certainly had a lot of influence throughout her lifetime.
His joy was complete. His rule was one of unprecedented success, and he shared it with his dearest friend, the trusted confidant of his youth. And his love, the love of his life, who he never would have met if he were not Sultan. His friend, Ibrahim, he continued to promote up the ranks until, after the fall of Rhodes, Suleiman asked him to serve as Grand Vizier. Ibrahim protested and begged to not be promoted anymore lest his life be in peril, but he had just laughed and assured his friend that no one would put him to death so long as he, Suleiman, reigned. How could decisions made out of such love be wrong? And so there he was, the mightiest monarch of the mightiest empire of the modern world, ready to conquer life with his true love and his one true friend,
Okay, we might be getting a little too personal with it, okay? I'm not sure being the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was so much about love and friendship, but, I understand Suleiman was a person like the rest of us, but, maybe a bit of a strange focus.
Faithfully by his side. His own sister married Ibrahim, and it was a night of splendor like the empire hadn't seen since the greatest monarchs of Rome. In his youth, he'd never known family, but he knew one now. But trouble began to show, for Ahmed Pasha, second vizier, had thought that he was going to be promoted to the post of Grand Vizier. He had worked and toiled and intrigued to see that the former Grand Vizier had been dismissed after Rhodes, but now, seeing that Ibrahim had been appointed to the post, he knew he would never attain the position. So instead, he asked for, and was granted, the governorship of Egypt. As Egypt had only entered the empire a generation before by conquest, and was far from Istanbul, he knew it would be easy to rebel there.
A good place to rebel from, of course a relatively new province, but a pretty prosperous province, so there's definitely some value in being out there.
Quietly sent word to all quarters, even to the Christians, asking for allies. Then, one night, he had all the local janissaries massacred and declared himself Sultan of Egypt. The rebellion was put down, but after that...
And of course, Egypt's always had a lot of autonomy, which you can see really, of course, Egypt had been its own independent civilization all the way back to the ancient times, and at times it had been independent, at times it had been under foreign empires, but it had always maintained its own thing, its own independent identity. And even under the Ottomans, especially when you move a little later, Egypt would become quite autonomous once again. And we can see a degree of that autonomy and rebellion even here.
Rebellion after rebellion cropped up, so Suleiman sent the only man he could trust to try and bring the situation to heel. And Ibrahim succeeded. He crushed the remaining embers of rebellion in Egypt and in Syria, but he did more than that, for his genius was not just military. He reorganized the provinces, putting in a system of checks and balances to make sure that no one group could become powerful enough to challenge the Sultan, and those provinces had never rebelled again. After this, Suleiman began to rely on his friend more and more for the daily administration of the empire. Ibrahim was capable.
I mean, that's how it often worked, right? That was the job of the vizier, to do the daily work of actually running the empire that the Sultan maybe didn't have the time to do, or in the case of many sultans, didn't want to do, right? That is the role, the point of having a vizier like Ibrahim.
Rude, and most of all, loyal. And even he, the great sultan, could not by himself manage an empire so large. And so they planned and they plotted for the next stage of his campaign. He would cow the Persians with words and make the world think that he was going to go after his Shia rivals to the south. But in truth, he planned to once again invade Hungary and finish what he'd started.
Yeah, well, a lot of the Ottoman Empire's expansion in recent times, say under Suleiman's predecessor, had been sort of southwards, but I always feel like the Ottoman Empire is honestly a more sort of northwards or westwards facing empire. Really, from its origins, of course, it had started in western Anatolia. It had been interested in westwards expansion into Europe, Constantinople, and then sort of further into Europe. And of course, it conquers a lot of territory south and east in the Middle East, in North Africa, and it's got more territory to conquer. But it is definitely interested in gaining more territory in the Balkans and sort of into Central Europe. That's always been a major focus point of the Ottomans.
Meanwhile, he also worked
in many ways, the Ottomans saw themselves as the inheritors of a couple of different legacies. Of course, the inheritors of the caliphate in the position of caliph, but also as the inheritors of the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Same difference, right? They saw themselves as the inheritors to that legacy as well, right? The grand, great empire, the one true empire. And so they truly wanted to conquer and rule over all this territory as far as they consider themselves, the one true legitimate empire.
Once again invade Hungary and finish what he'd started. Meanwhile, he also worked with Ibrahim on his other great project, the Kanuni, or laws. He had long since realized that there were things that Sharia simply did not cover, things that were vital to a modern, evolving empire.
Yeah, and this is classic for a great emperor. They always get involved in the laws. I mean, they compared Suleiman in the first episode to Justinian, right? This great Eastern Roman Empire, who also greatly expanded the territory of his empire, but also set about essentially reforming and just writing down the laws of his empire, simplifying things to a certain extent, centralizing, and that's what we see with Suleiman. Like any great emperor, he says, hey, wait a minute, let's try and reform our laws, right? Like I said, something any great emperor takes a look at.
Things like taxation.
In part, just to make the empire run better, absolutely, but also there's a lot of power in controlling the laws. It allows you to essentially shape how things are done, shape the daily rhythm of life, centralize power. I mean, Napoleon puts out his law code, the Napoleonic Code. Yes, I think because he believed in good government and all that type of stuff, but also because he understood the power it gave him, right? I think Justinian probably understood that. Suleiman probably understands that as well. But there is genuine benefit to doing something like this for the empire.
Did not cover things that were vital to a modern, evolving empire. Things like taxation and certain aspects of administration. His ancestors, too, had realized this to some degree, but he wanted to take it further, to really rationalize the hodgepodge of laws made by those before him. But even as his legal scholars began to put together the laws, the preparations for his Hungarian war were completed. It was time to campaign again. Europe was more divided than ever, with a league of almost every Christian nation formed to fight against Charles V and the Habsburgs. Hungary would once again be alone. With 100,000...
Yeah, I mean, and I often talk about how the Christian powers were usually not united, and in fact were divided against each other. But when we talk about the Christian powers being divided, I mean, this is really a moment of division like you hadn't seen for a while, right? The Reformation. The Reformation leads to a whole era of religious war in Europe, Christian v. Christian, Protestant v. Catholic, right? So these European powers are extremely divided, and they're usually pretty divided, but they're divided even more at this time. That really provides an opportunity for the Ottomans to step in and conquer more and more territory.
Men, with his vizier and friend Ibrahim as their principal commander, Suleiman marched north for Buda. Then the rains began. Torrents, sheets of rain, rivers overflowed their banks, roads were turned into marshes, but the iron discipline of army held. Some of the larger cannons were lost or delayed, but it was of little consequence. His great army marched north. As they reached Sofia, Ibrahim broke off a small contingent to capture the fortress of Petrovaradin, while he, the Sultan, continued the march north with the main force. Mere days later, his favorite rode back to him with spoils and the heads of 500 of the castle's defenders in tow.
Oh, wow.
He had lost only 25 men.
Nice gift.
The Sultan embraced his favorite, and there was rejoicing in the camp. At last, they crossed the Danube, burning their bridges along the way so no man would think to retreat. After that came the peat bogs and the marshes that surrounded the river. They trudged through, equipment and horses having to be dragged out of the mire or abandoned along the way. But finally they emerged onto the shining Mohács plain. There before him were arrayed the Knights of Louis, the child king of Hungary. How small they looked, how pitiful in number. His great host would wash around them like a tide dragging a man out to sea. Ibrahim stood with him, looking out over the field. He was relaying intelligence recently gathered.
I will say, crossing over the Danube, it's not... I wouldn't say it's a crossing the Rubicon moment, because there's very different meanings in those two things, but crossing the Danube, you're really getting into sort of Central Europe proper at this point, you know what I mean? The Ottoman Empire, Ottoman forces have really extended pretty far northwards if you're crossing over the Danube.
There were only 25 or 30,000 men facing his 100,000. The impetuous nobles of Hungary had not even waited for the reinforcements coming to them. They had forced their king onto the field, and there they stood, in all their gleaming armor which would only slow them down. They'd not even set up defensive works. They clearly planned to take the offensive, using the shock of armored knights against the fire of his janissaries and his great guns. As his men drew up their lines, Ibrahim embraced him and rode off to take his place. As Ibrahim rode, he spoke to the men, promising them great wealth, glory, and the everlasting honor of adding new lands to the empire. Then he took his position at the front. The undisciplined Hungarians began their charge, moving not as one solid block, but as 1,000 groups of men, each eager to crush a foe that they thought inferior.
Not what you want to see, when you're talking about the Ottomans, who have this pretty well-disciplined army with the janissaries, who have a lot of firepower. Now, yes, they have lost a lot of their cannons on the way here, but still a lot of firepower, a disciplined army, versus this seemingly pretty disorganized European force, of a much smaller number, by the way.
Horses and men, iron and steel, 100 stone in weight, thundered down the plain, hooves tearing the sodden ground, riders shouting battle cries in a language Suleiman didn't understand. Volley after volley rolled out from his janissaries' muskets. Men in steel and plate fell, and yet they charged on. The flag of Ibrahim was everywhere on his side of the field, holding, rallying, attacking like a hawk. But on the other side, the desperate charge of desperate men pushed into the line, hacking and slashing their way forward. And then they were upon him. Suleiman's steed reared, his saber flashed. Something hit his breastplate. His guard were all around him, fighting a frenzied melee with some handful of knights that, in their furor, had somehow made it close to his person. And then it was over. Somewhere in there, the momentum had stopped. The suicidal bravery of those foolish and undisciplined knights had been met with a sterner bravery of the Sultan's troops, and raw numbers had won out. The Ottoman army slowly...
hey, a heavy cavalry charge, that can be an impressive force, and you can be outnumbered and perhaps even still win with a heavy cavalry charge, but they were greatly outnumbered. They had these well-disciplined Ottoman troops, good positioning, a lot of firepower. You can sort of see why the battle goes the way it does.
Enclosed the Hungarians and wiped them out. Only a handful managed to escape. Ibrahim rode up to him, still covered in the blood and dust of the battle. The historians would write of him that his lance was like the beak of the falcon of vigor, and his sword like the claws of the lion of bravery. They embraced again. They would
I've
celebrate
got a real bromance going on here with Ibrahim, huh?
this victory for many nights. But then a rider came up to him to report that the body of the Hungarian king had been found. They rode out to see it. Looking over this young corpse, he felt immense sorrow. Suleiman wanted this boy's kingdom. He'd needed his land, but
I do wonder, this is where my lack of knowledge of the subject matter sort of comes in. I do wonder what sources they're drawing from. You know, because in this series, they've talked a lot about Suleiman's personal emotions, his sorrow, and his love, and his friendships. I do wonder what sources we're drawing from, as in, do we have letters from Suleiman? Do we have diary entries? I'm not saying we don't, I just wonder, because the degree of detail we're talking about here, you would need pretty explicit sources from Suleiman himself, or I guess those around him, for these moments. Or are we doing a bit of sort of dramatization? Maybe some of you who are more familiar with the source material, and the sources in particular, can tell me that.
he'd not wanted this. But they had won a great victory for Islam, and Ibrahim had proven himself the man that Suleiman knew him to be. This promised only greater days ahead for them when they returned to the capital of the world, Istanbul.
Well, winner, winner, chicken dinner, as they say. So, Suleiman continues to win these great victories. He has moved even further northwards into Europe, getting closer and closer to who knows what. Perhaps Vienna? I mean, of course, we are moving towards Vienna. Even before it happened, everyone knew that was going to be the eventual goal, but as we've said, Suleiman keeps taking these points further and further north, winning these battles, rationalizing the legal system of the empire, all signs of a sort of archetypical great emperor throughout history, and we've got them here. So we'll once again get to talk more about Suleiman through the rest of the series. If you guys enjoyed this one, you could leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With that, hope you're all having a fantastic day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.